Anyone who becomes a prosecutor realizes the cases that you care about the most are the ones when the most innocent of us are hurt or murdered. If you can't protect them, then what are you doing? My grandma was 99 when she passed away, and I remember thinking, oh, she's super safe. When she went to her retirement home, nothing can happen to her. You have to feel that way. You need to feel that way. But in 2018, law enforcement officers around Dallas, Texas, happened upon a serial killer that was preying on a world of very vulnerable victims. Everyone assumed since the victims were older, they were dying of natural causes. But these were not natural deaths, it was murder. And the killer was able to take the lives of over 20 people.
Police say they plan to review every single death of an elderly woman in the area where there was no witness.
That morning, I was out running errands, and Scott called me and said he got a call from somebody who said that Mom didn't make it to the Dallas Cowboys watching party, and she wasn't at church.
It's terrifying when you get that call that somebody who's very reliable, who never missed a Cowboy game in the history of the Cowboys, was missing church, missing her friends, missing that Cowboy party, and not answering her phone. You panic. After calling our mother multiple times and her not answering, then it was very obvious there was something wrong. I contacted Rob, and we headed straight to the house.
I was the first one there, unlocked the door, called for her, ran through the living room, and I saw her feet sticking out on the side of the bed. She was really pale. Her arm was across her face. I took her arm across, and her glasses were all messed up. She was unresponsive, dead on her bedroom floor.
I'm just in shock.
2 weeks before, the doctor said, perfect health, you're gonna live another 20 years. What happened?
Your brain's trying to process that this woman that you'd spent Christmas with a week before is laying crumpled on the floor, dead. Rob stepped out to call 911. This flood of people to start rolling in. First responders, the EMTs, then the police show up. The detective had told me they've looked her over. They don't see any signs of a struggle, no bruising. They turned her back. Everything was fine.
We asked the police, hey, we noticed that she was missing her rings on her fingers, her wedding ring and then the ring that my dad got her.
That she never took off. These were fixtures, and they were gone.
And they say old people hide stuff. The police didn't think there was any foul play. It was natural causes.
Our mother was very engaged in church, very supportive of the community. She was a very positive person. She was very optimistic. Things were always going to work out, keep a positive attitude, look to the future, be nice to people, things tend to work out. That was kind of how she lived her life.
Sweet, sweet lady.
Couldn't have asked for a better woman to raise us, to be there for us through our entire lives.
When you think of the safest, nicest, most well-off part of Dallas County, you think of Plano, Texas. It's where you go when you have everything. So if your mother is retired there, living in a home there, you're going to think she's pretty safe. But in 2018, all that was put into question.
Plano 911, what's the emergency?
We have a neighbor that we cannot awake.
Okay, is she breathing?
Yes, she is breathing.
Okay, and how old are they?
She must be almost 90.
Okay.
We can't wake her up.
After the paramedic spoke with Mary Bartell, he felt there was something more to this story, and he wanted an officer to investigate this. I responded to the hospital, spoke with Mary Bartell, introduced myself to her, and asked her if she would tell me in her own words what had happened. At around 8:30 in the morning, she walks to her front door after hearing constant knocking. As she was going to the door, this suspect pushes his way in. First thing she sees and focuses on is his green gloves. He told her to go to the bed, and she just complied. When she got to the bed, he pushed her down, grabbed one of her pillows from her bed, and put it on top of her face and chest and just pushed down real hard. Mary Bartell thought she was going to die. That's the last she remembers. Mary Bartell states that she was missing jewelry, rings that she had on both of her hands, one of those rings being a wedding ring that she's had for 50 years and never really took it off. My first priority was to get an investigator to Mary Bartell's house. So I contact another detective, and as she was going to process Mary Bartell's crime scene, she learns there is a suspicious death investigation right across the hall, which is Ann Conklin's residence. So at that point, the Plano Police Department was investigating one death, Ann Conklin, and attempted murder on Mary Bartell to see if they were related or not. We started to do a canvass, looking for any other witnesses, any other video, anything that would give us a lead. We learned that just a few days before, on March 15th, a gentleman by the name of Richard Plink picked up his mother to take her to a doctor's appointment and observed this black male, well-dressed, sitting in his Nissan Altima at Preston Place. And later, he noticed the same person was still in the same parking lot, but at a different parking spot. He just thought it was weird, so he asked him if he could help him with anything. And this man stated that he was fine, that he was just waiting for his next therapy appointment. That's not really unusual because there's older people in that community, but it was not settling to him. So he wrote down the license plate, and when we ran it, we learned the driver of that car was listed as Billy Schmiermeyer. So we started looking at Billy Schmiermeyer a little bit more and learned that he had some prior arrests for criminal trespass at another senior living center in Dallas. Now we know that we need to locate Billy Schmiermeyer. There was this red jewelry box with a name of Lou T. Harris.
With the possibility of more victims on their hands, officers do a welfare check on Lou T. Harris.
4 or 5 cases quickly jumped to almost 10 cases.
An attack on a 90-year-old woman named Mary Bartell leads police to the connection of another case that might be related in another part of Dallas, where a suspect named Billy Schmiermeyer had a prior arrest for a criminal trespass at another senior living facility 2 years earlier.
Edgemere is a senior living facility in Dallas. And in April of 2016, security personnel had noticed that this man had been around and they weren't sure why, and he was given a warning not to return. Then he did return in June.
This man is stating that he was a healthcare worker involved with the location, which ultimately was not true. And Dallas PD identified him as from Billy Schmiermeyer. He had no affiliation with that location and was given a criminal trespass. So we had started looking at Billy Schmiermeyer a little bit more. Billy Schmiermeyer is an individual who came to the United States in the early 2000s from Kenya, who had a visa for a short period of time to be here to work and got into the healthcare business as a caregiver. So we started getting very suspicious that maybe our person of interest in the attack on Mary Bartell and the death of Ann Conklin is Billy Schmiermeyer. We learned from Dallas PD that Billy Schmiermeyer had a warrant out for his arrest for public intoxication out of Dallas. Detective Triviate and I discussed it and said, he's a person of interest. Let's get him in custody, bring him to the Plano Police Department jail, sit down and talk to him and see what we learn. The arrest team set several officers throughout his apartment complex. A person who we believe to be Billy Schmermer drove in around 6 p.m. We had a detective near a dumpster. Billy Schmermer drives to that dumpster and then discarded some items. He was able to see Billy Schmermer get back into his car and drive to his assigned parking space. They went up to him and made the arrest. And when they extracted him out of the vehicle, on his person, Billy Schmermer had some jewelry, bracelets, some $2 bills. As they detained him, they went and looked at the dumpster to find out what did he discard. There was this red jewelry box, and it had miscellaneous items with a name of Lou T. Harris.
With the possibility of more victims on their hands, while Billy Schmermer is being detained, officers do a welfare check on Lou T. Harris, who lives in the Dallas city limits, which borders Plano, Texas.
Upon our arrival, we were told by Dallas PD that Ms. Harris was located inside the residence. The residence was secure, and she was found deceased next to her bed. Everything appeared to be natural. We discussed with Dallas PD deployment that we were investigating, specifically Mary Bartell, and that the likelihood of the weapon being a pillow, because that's what Mary Bartell described her weapon to be. They went back inside and found a smeared lipstick on Lou T. Harris's pillow. We also informed them that we found a set of keys in the center console of the car that Billy Schmermer was arrested out of. And they confirmed that the keys go to her front door. At that point, they agreed based on what they found and our investigation with Mary Bartell, it was decided that Dallas PD Homicide needed to get involved.
I'm feeling a lot of fear and panic because we've never had police presence on our street. One of the neighbors told me Lou T had been murdered. To think that something like this would have happened to Lou T was beyond sad. Lou was friendly. She was funny.
Lou T. Harris is a fascinating woman. She had grown up in Vietnam, and she was actually airlifted out of Saigon when it fell. She married an American man, and she made a life for herself here in Texas.
In 2018, Lou was living by herself. Her husband had already passed away. So you never really thought about, we need to make sure if she needs something, because she always gave you the complete sense of independence.
The day after the arrest of Billy Schmermer, my partner and I go to Dallas PD and go speak with Billy Schmermer in their interview room.
Detective Peruviarte. Plano Police. How you doing? Martinez. Good to meet you guys.
Billy Schmermer was just like a happy person, not a worry.
Been a busy night, hasn't it? It is. It is.
When Billy Schmermer was initially arrested, it was only for a Class C public intoxication, but that allows them to take him into custody and ask him questions about anything they want to. At some point after that, if they believe there's enough evidence to charge him with something else, they can.
Those people scared me yesterday, the officers. I was like, I thought that looked like a movie, and I was like, is this real?
Oh, it's real.
No,
Our thought process going into this is we're not going to probably get a confession from him.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
No, we just wanted him to talk and see what nuggets of evidence that we could use against him.
You're telling me that your phone stays with you?
Yeah.
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 No one else has that phone?
No.
When Billy Schmermer is being detained, shockingly, he agrees to voluntarily give them his cell phone. Maybe because at that time he didn't realize that would also give the investigators access to his text messages, any photos he had on his phone, and also his GPS locations.
So Monday would be the 19th.
Yes.
Or what'd you do that morning?
Oh, that morning I went to meet this guy on, I had a ring and to sell to this guy on, they're on 75 and Coit. There's a Starbucks there.
March 19th, when Mary Bartell was attacked and possibly Ann Conklin, he told us, he did go sell a ring. He went to Starbucks, but stated up and down that he was never at Preston Place in the morning. He was at home at the time.
You know the Preston Place is basically adult living center?
Your phone is telling us that you're there too.
No.
When we did legal process and got his cell phone records and got his location data, that was absolutely a lie.
If you're involved in this or not?
No, I'm okay.
And he was professing that he was innocent, not worried that he did anything wrong, that evidence was showed that he did nothing wrong. And it was like, okay, do you mind giving us your DNA?
Are you allowing us to get the buckle swab?
Yeah.
Okay.
You okay with that? Voluntarily giving that to us?
Sure.
Make sure you're okay with that.
I am very okay. Anything in there, fingerprints, lie detector test.
Okay.
After talking to Billy Shamir Mir, he was charged with the capital murder of Lou T. Harris and the attempted murder of Mary Bartell.
I want the truth.
That's I don't even need a lawyer, and I did not do any wrong.
Point of police.
Good. Martinez.
Billy Shamir Mir is under arrest for the attacks and murders of elderly women in Dallas and Plano, Texas. But they want to build their cases and find more evidence to make the cases even stronger.
Early in the morning, the time we were interviewing Billy Shamir Mir, Dallas PD was wrapping up their crime scene investigation in Lou T. Harris's home. They found that there was a receipt that showed a nearby Walmart and her making a purchase prior to her death, which led them to Walmart to investigate that further. And learned that Billy Shamir Mir was also at that same Walmart just prior to Lou T. Harris being killed in her home. It is suspected that Billy Shamir Mir is at that Walmart hunting for victims. He's scoping out Lou T. Harris, doing some surveillance on her, looking for opportunity and to determine if this is going to be someone he can victimize.
As you have detectives working on the cases in Plano and in Dallas, the investigators become aware of yet another case in Richardson, Texas. Mary Brooks died 2 months prior to the first cases.
Mary Brooks was an 87-year-old woman who was living in the Dallas area. On January 31st, 2018, Mary Brooks's grandson gets a call from his mother, who's worried about her mother, and she asks him to check on her. And the grandson found that his grandmother was dead.
I was just going to do one last look at her just to make sure I didn't see any suspicious wounds or anything.
There were groceries all out on her counters. They hadn't been put away, and her family discovered missing jewelry. And there was a receipt that showed that she had been on a shopping trip to Walmart.
Richardson PD's investigation led him to the same Walmart that Lou T. Harris was at. She was grocery shopping on the day she was killed, but they didn't have a suspect at that time until we learned of Billy Shamir Mir, Walmart, and Lou T. Harris. So then Richardson PD started to look, okay, can we put Billy Shamir Mir at the Walmart? When Mary Brooks was there, Richardson PD was able to show in the video Billy Shamir Mir was parked in relation to where Mary Brooks was parked. And when Mary Brooks returned to her car, you see the silver Nissan Altima, which is believed to be Billy Shamir Mir's vehicle, exit with her and follow behind her. And shortly after is when she was found deceased. We met with Dallas PD, Richardson PD, Frisco PD. They also had some stuff that they were very interested in Billy Shamir Mir being their person of interest. And when we looked at it, it's like, okay, let's look at the location data. Can we put Billy Shamir Mir there? Oh, we can. We were jumping from cases to cases, and 4 or 5 cases quickly jumped to almost 10 cases. And it spiderwebbed from that point.
On July 16th, 2018, there was a phone message from a task force that was investigating a killer who went around to independent living properties. My mother, Doris Gleason's death was being investigated as a homicide. It took my breath away. On Sunday, October 30th, 2016, I drove over to pick my mother up for church. I get to the door is unlocked. I walk in and see her on the floor over by the dining room table, and she was gone. She was 92. I felt shock, sadness, a bit of devastation. I had never experienced a death like that. And then when I hear that Mama had been murdered, I am floored.
The detective who was working the Shamirmir case called me to go and look at pictures of jewelry that they'd gotten off of Billy Shamirmir's phone. We asked the detective, are you implying that you think that Billy Shamirmir killed our mother? And he said, I'm convinced of it. He said, I've already pulled records from his cell phone, and his cell phone was in the vicinity of her house on Saturday and on Sunday morning before you found her dead. Suddenly you find out she's died violently, and you start the grieving process all over again. And now you're grieving a violent death.
While Billy Shamirmir is in custody, 4 different police departments are already working on all these investigations, and the number is now up to 22 different victims. This makes Billy Shamirmir one of the most horrendous, prolific serial murders in Texas history. But will there be enough evidence on any one of these cases to actually convict him?
When the case first came into our office, there was talks about that we might have a serial killer that is preying on elderly individuals. To be honest with you, I didn't think it would turn into the volume of cases that it actually turned into. I just didn't think that was possible. In the end, he had 22 indictments for capital murder and 2 indictments for attempted capital murder out of not only our county, Dallas County, but also including Collin County. It is a lot. Just had total disregard for human life. And then judicial economy, in the end, you can't try all of these cases. We had what we believed the strongest case with the Lou T. Harris. Mr. Shamirmir was found with her property hours after being with her. We went back and found him at Walmart at the same time. And so that became a very strong case for us circumstantially.
Having Mama's case not being tried was incredibly frustrating, but I also recognize the need for the strongest case. The goal was to get those convictions. And if that wasn't my mom's case, then okay.
I was brought on to Billy's case and became one of his 3 attorneys. I was intrigued in regards to the facts and allegations in and of itself, and then just the sheer number of indictments that were coming out against Mr. Shamirmir. No matter the number of indictments or charges against him, he's simply accused. And that's what we have to make the jury aware of, is until they decide something different, meaning that the state has proven its case to each and every one of them beyond a reasonable doubt. He's just simply accused of these offenses.
The challenges in this case are, let's be honest, the amount of evidence was overwhelming. Was it circumstantial? Yeah, but what a lot of circumstantial evidence. That being said, you still have to present that evidence very understandably, very concisely. And the other big challenge you always have is you still have to pick your jury, and you better not pick one bad juror.
Our goal in this case was to see that Billy Shamirmir died in prison. In these types of cases for the death penalty, we would have to go to Kenya. We would have to do those types of things to do a good full background on him. That was unavailable to us. It was unavailable to the defense. And we would have to have delayed it even further. And we needed to get resolution to this case.
In the morning, jury selection will begin in Dallas for the trial of an alleged serial killer. That is Billy Shamirmir. The pandemic is going to prevent victims' families from witnessing his trial in person.
The whole scenario was just different. We were not allowed to have anybody in the courtroom that was not part of the trial. The victims' families, they couldn't face the person who had done this to their loved one. They had to watch it like everybody else did through closed circuit television.
If I'm on a jury in COVID time and the family members have to come in one by one with masks on to testify, that's not going to have the same impact as seeing a courtroom full of cops and victims' family members and people watching the trial. They didn't get the real feel of anybody's pain or anguish or frustration.
In opening statement, I really just want to tell the jury kind of a glimpse of what they're going to see, what they're going to hear, and how I believe the case is going to be set out. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about stalking, smothering, and stealing. When it came time to presenting evidence to the jury, we really wanted to show that there was a close connection to Billy Chemirmir and Ms. Harris. When the Plano Police Department arrested Billy Chemirmir, he had in his hands the jewelry of Lutie Harris. And I used family members to identify those items and say, yes, I recognize those as being things that she was wearing. Do you know any reason why she would get rid of these things?
No, those were her personal items that she wore every day.
We then present cell phone data showing Mr. Chemirmir's actions, placing him at locations that link directly to Lou Harris. We relied heavily on the FBI in putting together our mapping of the pattern of Billy Chemirmir on these days. Typically, he would go to a location where there is a victim. He would stay there for a certain amount of time, pick his victim, murder them, take their jewelry. Then he would travel down to a known location where you could sell these items and then head back home.
Are these cell phone records we see here March 15th, March 19th, and March 20th?
Yes, sir.
So to respond to this state, asserting that Billy was at these locations by way of the cell phone data, what their expert is able to say is that the device that they believe belonged to Billy Chemirmir was pinged or located in certain areas, but they cannot say that it was actually Billy himself. It's simply the device.
The defense's strategy in this case, with the overwhelming amount of evidence that there was to try to create reasonable doubt. You try to poke holes in each witness little by little and argue reasonable doubt. In this case, you would think that's a stretch because there was so much evidence, but sometimes that tactic works.
In criminal trials, using evidence of other crimes or bad acts is generally not admissible. However, it can be for limited purposes. In this case, it was more for motive and identity, since no one actually saw him kill anyone, but we wanted them to know that this same person with the same profile and the same similar acts had been with other women who were killed. This is the correct person. We have the right person.
Would you raise your right hand, please?
We decided to go with Mary Bartell because she brings to this case a voice for all the victims. She is the victim who survived, and she was able to tell her story through deposition.
I heard this very insistent rapping at the door. The door was opening inward, and when my eyes were just fixated on these green rubber gloves, I knew instantly, number one, I should not have opened the door. Number two, my life was in grave danger. He just smashed a pillow down hard over my face and my chest, and I just couldn't breathe.
The defense lawyer was able to cross-examine her in her deposition the same way he would have in the courtroom before COVID happened.
She said the individual that walked in was very articulate and very well spoken, and asked about an accent. She said she didn't recall hearing an accent.
You didn't notice any kind of accent or anything about his voice that stood out to you?
No, I was just mainly concerned about whether I could get some help before I died.
And anyone that's ever heard Billy speak, he has a very thick accent. And that's important. The jury needs to understand that that's important.
Did you ever look at his face?
I was fixated by the green rubber gloves.
Okay, so you never did get a look at his face?
No, I did not.
There was nothing that placed him there except for Mary Bartell. And so if you think she's mistaken or that credibility is not as high as what you would like it to be as a juror, then you set that case aside and ask yourself, is the evidence sufficient to prove that it was Billy beyond all reasonable doubt?
We wanted to show Mr. Chemirmir's interrogation video because Billy Chemirmir did not have a good story as to why he's in possession of Lou T. Harris's items. He stated that he acquired them from a man on the side of the road. He couldn't give us the man's name. It just seems so illogical that he is at Walmart with Lou T. Harris and then happens to buy from some random man her items hours later and is caught with them.
You had their money. You had their jewelry. And you had their jewelry box.
I believe them playing his statement backfired a little bit. And the reason I say that is because he gave himself a defense.
Do you think that the items are stolen?
That was what I was thinking, because I was like, why is he bringing all this, the box with everything?
Way too many times in my career, when I was getting ready for trial, I would tell my main detective, I'm not going to offer your interview of the defendant. And they would get very upset. And I would say, no, it's self-serving. He doesn't tell the whole truth. He minimizes his involvement. He acts like it's self-defense. Why would I offer his version of what happened? By presenting the videotaped interview of Billy Chemirmir, the state allowed that to be his way of putting his defense on. And they weren't able to cross-examine him at the same time because he never had to testify. And the state doesn't get to say, we call Billy Chemirmir to the stand. It's not up to them. If he chooses not to testify, that's the end of his story.
That's what this entire case is about, is reasonable doubt. And it is rampant.
There was so much evidence that they had introduced.
You've seen an exorbitant amount of evidence and items put in, but we're talking about quality and not quantity.
And that was my argument, is they're presenting all these things, but what is the quality of this evidence in regards to them meeting their burden?
In this day and age, with what juries expect today with modern forensics, which I'm so sick of hearing, there's no such thing as too much evidence. I wish we could all have that problem.
This is the first time in my career as a prosecutor I have been accused of bringing too much evidence. It was mentioned a couple of times that this is going to be a difficult chore on your part. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't think it's going to be that difficult. Once we concluded closing statements, cases in the jury's hands, we just have to wait now for their answer.
I happened to be there in the courthouse, and the evidence was so well laid out. So we were expecting 30 minutes later the jury to come back. And as that jury waited and waited and waited and then went home to come back the next day, we were very concerned.
And it went a little longer and kept going a little longer. And I said, well, somebody's back there thinking.
This case should have been a slam dunk, and you would expect a quick verdict. But it took over 2 days. The jury was still deliberating, and they still hadn't come up with a verdict.
After several notes that were sent out by the jury, they were deadlocked, unable to reach a verdict.
Judge Jones, we remain deadlocked at 11-1. After additional deliberation, we received no change.
Then I moved and requested a mistrial, and it was granted.
Mistrial has occurred, or a hung jury has occurred.
We are just disappointed that they could not come to the correct and right, obvious. Yeah.
I don't have a word to describe the unfairness, the injustice.
Given that Lou T. Harris's case was, by the prosecutor's judgment, their strongest case, and they got a hung jury, they had to have been devastated when they got that back. Unfortunately, what all those family members learned is with the jury, you never know what's going to happen.
When I heard of the mistrial, I was disappointed for the families and immediately started thinking about participating in the second trial.
The elected DAs in big counties have a huge office to run. 300 lawyers work for them. So when the DA, John Crusoe, comes aboard to try the case with Glenn Fitzmartin, that's a big deal.
We went into the second trial terrified of another mistrial.
I think there was also resolve on the part of the families to come back and make sure that we did whatever we could to help the DA to close that case on the next time through.
In the second trial, the COVID restrictions have lessened a little bit, so we're now able to put the courtroom back to the way we're used to it, where spectators are allowed in, family members are allowed in.
The court was filled with so many families from other victims feeling like that may be their day in court, and certainly hoping for justice for Lucci, but also justice for their family members also.
I've been licensed for 42 years, and I was a judge for 22 years, so I saw a lot of cases tried. To me, voir dire is probably the most important part of the case.
Voir dire, it's not the glamorous part, but it's the part where you better not get it wrong, because if you do, one juror can ruin everything. In this case, they had to voir dire question a whole big group of people at the same time, and then to decide how many strikes they were going to use against how many people.
So looking back after we had a hung jury, I thought that we could do better in the jury selection process. I think the art of jury selection is understanding what your issues and problems are and being able to fashion a voir dire that help them understand exactly what the law was. For example, circumstantial evidence, and helping them understand that circumstantial evidence does not mean weak evidence, and committing to, if we prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt with circumstantial evidence, they could return a verdict of guilty.
It makes me crazy that too many people think that circumstantial evidence cases are weak, because they're not, and they never have been, and they never will be, because every little piece points to the same thing, and every little piece is the truth, and when you put them all together, how beautiful can that be?
The main difference in this trial is that you do not see the taped police interview with Billy Shamir.
I didn't go to anybody's apartment.
When they didn't play the interview at the arrest, that was a game changer, because that way he wasn't able to spew his lies without any cross-examination.
During the closing argument, District Attorney Crusoe linked the evidence back to what he had talked to the jurors about in his voir dire in the selection of the jury.
I told them we're counting on them to do what they promised under oath that they would do, and reminding them of the issues that we went over with them, especially circumstantial evidence. If you had said no, you wouldn't be on this jury. We brought you the evidence, and the only thing left is your job to deliberate, follow the law, and in our opinion, return a verdict of guilty.
The argument still is, it's still beyond a reasonable doubt, that it's extremely circumstantial. Argument is still that there's no direct evidence placing him in the home of Lucci Harris. There's no direct evidence placing him on the street of Miss Harris. There's no direct evidence even in the extraneous case that places him in Miss Bartell's home or neighborhood.
At the end of all the closing arguments, I think there's a healthy amount of anxiety in everybody in the courtroom, especially the families, because they've watched this not turn out well a few months before. And for me, I know, because of 42 years of practicing law, that I have no idea what they're going to do.
This was a stunningly fast verdict for a capital murder trial. Jury deliberated less than an hour.
It's like pins and needles. It's high anxiety. But we had the rug pulled out from us before, so our trust is really low that this is going to be okay.
The jury has reached a verdict, and that verdict is: we, the jury, unanimously find the defendant guilty of capital murder as charged in the indictment.
Billy Shamir was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And I knew at that moment in time that Billy Shamir would die in prison.
I have goosebumps when the jury renders the conviction that he is guilty. There is such a flood of relief.
On behalf of the many victims, we are incredibly relieved that justice is finally here, especially after the mistrial 5 months ago.
There was a lot of relief and joy that justice had finally been done.
About time. Why did it take two? But everybody's just as happy as can be that he's never going to get out of prison.
I look at Lucci's death and I could sound strange, but I think that she would be proud to know that she ended all of that, all of those killings, that was the end. After her, that was it. And they got him.
Well, what was satisfying about this verdict was that Mr. Shamir Mir had announced to a news station that he would never go to the penitentiary. And when that verdict came back, of course, I looked at him. He didn't have much expression, but I thought, you're on your way, buddy.
I think the whole experience has got us both thinking about how to protect elderly people.
When I worked through that, Mama was the 8th victim in 3.5 months, and that this had happened at 3 other well-respected properties in the Metroplex. That's when I knew that something had to change. Secure Our Senior Safety is a nonprofit foundation committed to showing the vulnerabilities in independent senior living and hopefully correcting those vulnerabilities. SOSS is proud that we got 2 bills through on legislation to change the security in independent living. My mother was incredibly private, and that was a real big struggle for me in the beginning. She believed a lady's name was in the paper when she got married and when she died. And so for my mother's face to be splattered everywhere in her name, my mother would not like that. But over time, I think Mama understands my commitment to make her friends safer than she had been. And in that way, I think she's proud of it.
Can you imagine the impact and the horror that came on over 20 different families because of all the people that Billy Shamir Mir murdered? I think the good that came of this is that those facilities have made stronger safeguards. Some laws have changed to try and ensure that that keeps happening. And let's hope that when we have our grandparents and parents and even us go into places like that from now on, they're way more protected as a result of what happened in this case. In 1994, I took on one of the newest, biggest cold cases that I ever handled in my career. And at that time, I was a pretty new chief of one of the district courts in Harris County. The sudden deaths of John and Ruth High happened 6 years earlier in 1987. The Highs were a really nice elderly couple, but there were a lot of dark twists and turns trying to figure out what happened with this case. What the investigators uncovered was a person so twisted and diabolical that he even started to believe his own lies, and that's what made him even harder to catch.
Even if, for instance, there was something that I had done and I confessed to it, y'all dragged right down with me.
He's equal to the core.
It took a cleverly devised phone call ruse to try and get enough evidence on the killer, but would that be enough? I had to go to trial basically relying on the testimony of one pretty unsympathetic witness. How are y'all?
Good, how are you?
Oh my God, so good to see you.
Good to see you too.
It's been too long, you know it?
Too long.
Too much. How are you? How are you? Give me a hug.
All right.
I remember this case because it was one of my first introductions to the best guys at HPD homicide, because it was my first cold case and because the victims were so sweet and innocent. What were the family dynamics back then?
Everything was normal.
Well, I recently graduated college and recently got married. So.
And I was in college at the time.
When it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So talk about that day when you first hear that something horrible's happened.
I was with my dad at one of the facilities we operate, and we were there working together, and my mother called him and said that nobody's heard from my grandparents.
And he went over there to check on him.
Mm-hmm.
October 8th, 1987, 5 p.m. in the afternoon, the Houston Police Department receives a phone call from a gentleman named Ken High. He was concerned about his parents. They had not been able to reach him by telephone, and so Ken High had gone around the house, peeking in the windows, and he noticed his mother was laying on the bed, and he was concerned that she may have passed away. And he wanted an officer to come there to perform a welfare check. The officer arrives, he meets Pat and Ken High. The officer notices newspapers on the front of the porch. The door was locked. And so the officer makes the decision that he's going to kick the door in. The officer immediately detects the strong odor of gas, and he observes an elderly male on the floor. Face down, there's a pool of blood around his head. There's an outdoor gas cooker hooked to the dryer gas jet just inside the kitchen. You would not want to use that type of cooker inside the house. The officer immediately turns the gas jet off, and the gas starts dissipating in the residence. And he looks at the body. To him, it's obvious that this person had been dead for several hours. Since it's the High's residence and it's an elderly male on the floor, the initial assumption is that it would be John High. Next, the officer proceeds to the master bedroom. He finds who he believes is Ruth High. There was a book beside her, and one of the pages was folded over as if she fell asleep while reading her book.
My partner and I are sent to the scene. I did the inside work, trying to determine if there's anything indicating foul play. We had to wait on the medical examiner because we're not really allowed to touch the body for further wounds. My partner, who was doing the witness portion, he informed Ken and his wife that his parents were deceased, possibly of gas inhalation.
My dad and my grandparents were very close. He was devastated.
I just couldn't believe that both my grandparents were gone at the exact same time. That just doesn't happen to many people.
So what you have at the scene is the smell of gas. You see a gas cooker hooked up in the kitchen. You see an elderly man, John High, lying on the kitchen floor. You see Ruth lying what appears to be peacefully asleep in her bed. No forced entry and nothing stolen from the house.
It was the officer's belief that John had fallen while messing with the gas cooker, struck his head, knocked himself unconscious, and either died from that wound or gas asphyxiation, and that Ruth High had fallen asleep and that she was overcome by the gas fumes as they moved through the house. It's an accidental death. They wrap it up, and that was it.
This is Grandma and Grandpa on their 50th wedding anniversary.
Oh, wow. They got dressed up a lot.
They got dressed up a lot.
No kidding. Look at that.
My grandmother was a native Houstonian. She was a homemaker.
She loved bridge. She loved her friends, loved to get dressed up for different events.
My grandfather worked for a Gulf Oil Corporation for 49 years. He was a geologist. He enjoyed being outdoors, golfing, fishing.
Oh, how cute.
This with both of us.
That's y'all?
That's both of us, yes.
And Susie, the dog. We had Christmas Eve with our grandparents every year, and now we continue that as well. And that's what keeps them alive for us.
On the 9th of October, I was instructed to travel to the medical examiner's office and meet with Dr. Perungal, who had performed the autopsies. The medical examiner immediately informed us that John died from 6 blunt trauma blows to his head. It created 6 lacerations, 2 to 3 inches in length. This is not a natural or an accidental death. John High had been murdered. After it was determined that John was murdered, we need further investigation because there was no forced entry into the house and there was nothing to indicate that Ruth was murdered. There was a possibility that Ruth High had killed her husband. It could have been a murder-suicide and that she died because the gas building up in the house. We need to return to the scene to see if we can find any information, any evidence that would be helpful.
I think the key to investigating any murder-suicide is to be methodical, thorough, and make sure you don't overlook any single detail. Finding any forensic evidence becomes top priority.
After the medical examiner's report, going back to a scene, we noticed some things. When someone is struck in the head, you have cast-off blood, and some of that was detected on some spots of the wall. And we found an axe handle behind a curtain in Ruth's bedroom. We think there's a possibility it might be the murder weapon, but we're not sure, so we collected as evidence.
There's a gas jet cooker on the floor. The gas cooker is designed to cook crawdads or shrimp. I went to the refrigerator and checking in the freezer, and I did not find any shrimp. There was a candle that had been lit, but it was out. If it was designed to set the gas off, somebody didn't know that. Natural gas doesn't behave that way. It tends to rise, so a candle would not have affected it.
This makes us think that somebody has planned this. Someone left the gas on in hopes that the house would blow up. And in the process of blowing up, destroy any evidence on the body. And then it's going to burn any other evidence up inside the house.
Murder-suicide was just unbelievable. My grandparents had a wonderful relationship.
Seeing them at their 50th wedding anniversary, knowing them from my childhood, that just was not possible. They loved each other way too much for anything like that to happen.
We suspected double homicide or a capital murder. It was something that we would have to look into. Something that was unusual was John and Ruth's will were lying on the table in the living room.
John and Ruth High made the beneficiaries of their estate Ken High and his brother Gary High. Their estate was around $300,000 to $500,000. So everybody in the family needs to be questioned. You just can't arrest somebody. We need something.
It was a cold case.
The male, who refuses to identify himself, begins talking about a double murder that happened in '87.
One day has passed since the deaths of Ruth and John High. The murder investigation that started out as an accident and then turned into a murder-suicide based on what they saw and thought happened. The investigators realized how important it was for them to interview Ruth and John's sons, but the medical examiner called first.
Dr. Perungau called the homicide office. When he looked closer at Ruth, he noticed she had bruising on the inside of her lower lip, consistent with her lower teeth. Then he sees petechiae, small blood vessels that break when you're suffocated or strangled. She was probably smothered with a pillow or some sort of object forcefully against her face, causing the lips to be bruised by the teeth. Ruth High was murdered just like her husband.
With that knowledge, then the investigators needed to go back to the scene because there is no forced entry and the doors are locked and nothing appears to be stolen, and consider the idea that this is going to be somebody committing this murder who's in the world of John and Ruth High. Usually when you're talking about a murder, it's going to come down to one of three different main motives. It's going to be either greed or jealousy or revenge. But it sure feels like money is going to be the main factor here because they're worth some money. The number one priority would be to start talking to family members and very close friends about all the dynamics going on with that family.
Ken High He's very successful. He's married, has 2 kids. He's close to his mother and father, but doesn't get to see them real often. He explains that he's not very close with his brother, Gary High. He blames that on their age difference. Ken is 8 years older than Gary.
Uncle Gary, my dad's brother, is the type of person that did not talk much, very reserved, very quiet, not very emotional. You just couldn't break that shell to get to know him.
We learned from Ken High about the guy named Duncan, Chuck Duncan. Chuck was the last person to speak to John and Ruth High. Chuck Duncan is business partner of Gary High, but he's also a lover to Gary.
Chuck was over at my grandparents' house all the time, doing stuff for them, helping them go to the doctors and things like that. He was always being invited to family events. He was pretty much included with anything that Gary would have been invited to.
As the investigation proceeds, we learn that Gary High is in a business called High Tech with 2 other people, Chuck and Robbie Duncan.
Ken felt that the company was not doing real well. They were having financial problems.
Ken opens up and he thinks Gary has been asking his dad for money. We need more information.
On October 9th, Gary, Chuck, and Robbie come into the homicide office and are interviewed.
The 3 men had a very unusual relationship. They were business partners, they were roommates, they were friends, and they were lovers.
We learned Robbie actually has changed his name from his birth name to match the name of Chuck Duncan. The 3 individuals function as a family unit, all live together, with Chuck being the head of the family. It's obvious during the interviews that he has firm control over Robbie and Gary High. Chuck wanted to lead the conversations. Like if you said, what did you do yesterday? And if they go to answer, he said, oh, remember you went to... It's like it's a little bit of a cult leader. You know, he's got such control over them. Chuck explains that he sees John and Ruth High often. He ran errands for them, even took John High to the doctor. The subject of the cooker comes up, and Chuck says that John High wanted to fry some shrimp. So Chuck went out and purchased a cooker and delivered it to the Highs. At the scene, we noticed some wills laying out in the open on a table inside the residence. Chuck alleges that John High and Ruth High wished to change their will and leave their inheritance to Gary. When the subject came up, Gary was surprised. You could tell by the expression on his face that he had never heard that before. I think in Chuck's mind, if he could have John and Ruth change their will, cut their oldest son out, then he would control whatever their inheritance was worth, $500,000.
We started questioning Gary, Chuck, and Robbie about their business to see whether they were having financial problems.
They said the company was doing well. So when we asked them how much money was in the bank, they guessed about $40,000. Bank records indicate something else. It was less than $10,000.
So then we tried to determine where they were when the murders happened. Gary and Robbie were in Seattle, Washington, where they were trying to set up a new business. Chuck was in Houston. He adamantly denied that he had anything to do with a double homicide, and even suggested that a gardener or a yard worker or something like that may be responsible for this.
Chuck Duncan is very smart and manipulative and controlling, and he's quick on his feet to come up with explanations and answers to convince HPD of what happened.
As investigators, Chuck raises the flag for us for a couple of reasons. One, he's the last person that saw John and Ruth High. Two, he is in dire straits financially. but you got to have evidence. You just can't arrest somebody.
When I first went to Special Crimes and they started to bring me all their cold cases, there were a couple that came through where I would read them and I would know who did it, but I didn't think there was enough to charge it. So I would keep the file and I put them in this drawer in my office, and I named the drawer my Waiting on God drawer. Those were the cases where I thought one day something's going to come along from God, from heaven, to make this case get solved. For example, a divorce, somebody getting out of prison, somebody all of a sudden coming forward with new information after so many years can make the case change. You're waiting on God to make it happen. 6 years after the murder of Ruth and John High, the Waiting on God drawer came into play, and God finally made something happen.
In August of 1993, night shift officer working in the desk in the homicide office receives a phone call from a male who refuses to identify himself and begins talking about having knowledge about a double murder that happened in '87. He even names John and Ruth High. He talks about his knowledge of it. Wants to know what kind of trouble he could be in. The officer, he tape records it. When I'm listening to the tape recording, I recognize his voice. It's Robbie.
Robbie Duncan was the third member of the triangle relationship between him and Chuck and Gary. At some point after the investigation kind of quieted down, Robbie Duncan left the relationship. He talked a lot about how much control Chuck Duncan had over both him and Gary, and how good it felt to get out of that controlling relationship.
After Robbie called the night shift desk, Johnny Moore came to me. He had this cold case that was 6 years old, the murder of John and Ruth High. So myself and Johnny Moore drove out to Kingwood, where Robbie was living. He greeted us, invited us in, was very cordial, and almost like a weight was off of his shoulders because he was cooperating with law enforcement and doing the right thing.
He's willing to talk, but he has concerns. He wanted immunity. And we decided to offer him limited immunity. If he didn't commit the murder, he would not be prosecuted.
Robbie was granted limited immunity, meaning that anything he would testify to under oath couldn't be used against him. It made him feel safer, which helped further the prosecution of the case.
He said during their life together, Chuck would bring up the subject of if the Highs would just die.
According to Robbie, Chuck believed that the Highs were millionaires. So if Gary came into the inheritance from his parents, Chuck would definitely benefit through his relationship with Gary. Robbie admits that Chuck was talking about committing the murders to benefit them financially, but he claims he didn't know when it was going to happen.
One day, on October of 1987, Robbie and Gary decide to go to Seattle to see if it was good to move their company there. Chuck Duncan calls up to Seattle. Chuck tells Robbie, I did it, it's over. John fought like hell, and Ruth went peacefully.
Then Robbie said, talk to Gary, handed the phone to Gary. Gary has a blank, sharp stare, not speaking much. There wasn't a sense of excitement that they're finally dead or that there was trepidation that they were going to get caught. It was more of a realization that the murders had been carried out.
During my 16 years in homicide, I've come across a lot of killers. Chuck Duncan is evil to the core. You know, they were friends with him. He doted over them. But he doted over them with a sick purpose to worm his way into their money. I mean, he had to plan this. This is his cold-blooded murder.
Knowing about a crime after it's been committed, knowing who did it and knowing what happened, but yet not reporting it to the police does not make Robbie guilty of a crime in Texas. And so choosing not to come forward to tell on Chuck doesn't make them guilty of anything. Makes a jury not like them, doesn't make them guilty.
There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints or video recordings or anything of the crime. And so we formulated a plan on how to get incriminating information and build a stronger case against Chuck.
Let's see if we can get Robbie to make a phone call to Gary High and Chuck Duncan, and hopefully get Chuck Duncan to make some sort of admission.
If you have someone, a civilian like Robbie, acting on behalf of the police, that might not be allowed if you're calling somebody who's locked up in prison behind bars. You got to remember, Duncan is in the free world. The same rules don't apply. That's why this is not entrapment.
There's always a danger to tipping off the suspect in the case when you have someone who is not an actor play this role. Chuck answered the phone. They started talking, and I'm standing there writing notes to Robbie on what to say.
Is Gary still living with you?
He had a lot of trouble after the situation. Gary went into a deep, deep tailspin.
And then Robbie said, there's a private investigator who's looking into this matter. He's going to ask questions. What should I say?
I don't know if he's going to ask, you know.
Don't. You don't have to answer anything.
Robbie's trying to be really good about how he handles him. But when he says, I wished you wouldn't have done that, Chuck says, I didn't do nothing. I'm not guilty of anything. But somewhere a long ways down in there, he indicates that he did it for the family unit.
We've gone through it. It's over with. It's behind us. And even if, for instance, there was something that I had done and I confessed to it, do you think you and Gary wouldn't be unscathed by it? I mean, y'all be dragged right down with me.
The most incriminating thing that Chuck said was, law enforcement has no evidence. Just stick with the story. You got to be strong, because if I go down and confess, then everybody goes down.
Well, yeah, you know, that's why.
I won't allow that to happen. I won't.
He was threatening that they could all be implicated. And that was essentially making a tacit admission that he was involved in the murder of John and Ruth High.
I remember listening to those tapes, listening for that juicy slip-up that Chuck Duncan made. There's not one. There's more little subtle innuendos, things that you wouldn't say if you were completely innocent. But the context of these tape-recorded conversations, along with the financial incentive with Ruth and John's inheritance, the fact that the company was really crumbling and not doing financially well at all, you have your motive. The fact that Chuck Duncan was the last person to see them alive, and that along with all the other circumstances about how the house was left that day, that's enough to move the case forward.
We then secured an arrest warrant for Chuck Duncan for capital murder.
After getting our recordings of the telephone conversations between Chuck, Gary, and Robbie, we obtained an arrest warrant for Chuck Duncan. Sergeant Belk and I flew to Seattle, where Gary and Chuck are now living.
We met with a fugitive task force. I approached the front door with a couple of police officers, and they banged on the door. There was a long delay. They kept banging on the door, and then eventually looked up on the second floor, and a white male looked out the blinds at us.
Eventually, Chuck came to the door, and he was told he was under arrest for murder.
There was not much reaction from Chuck Duncan when we took him into custody.
Gary Hise and Chuck Duncan. Our information was that they were living together, so it was not a surprise that he was there.
My goal was to try and talk to Gary while the tension was high and see if I could get him to cooperate. Gary asked, am I under arrest? And I said, no, you're not under arrest. And he said, well, if I'm not under arrest and you don't have a search warrant, then y'all need to leave the townhome. I mean, Gary's parents were murdered and he refused to cooperate, refused to talk to us, ordered us out of the house.
We have nothing whatsoever to indicate that he helped plan it. And we know he didn't participate in it. So he gets to walk.
When your dad realized that his own brother could be involved, can you talk about how that affected your dad?
Never have seen him so sad in all my life.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think he just felt so deceived. And so, you know, how could this happen?
I think I'd be mad too, mad and sad, and just want to scream at your brother.
It was more about Chuck.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? What do you think he ended up thinking about it?
Chuck just had control over Gary.
Even before all this, you could tell?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
Chuck was taken to a local law enforcement agency and read him his legal warnings. He acknowledged that he understood the warnings and waived them and was willing to talk, which was no surprise because he was a talker. I mean, and he thought he could talk his way out of everything.
He thinks he's smarter than you are. So he's trying to figure out what I might have or might not have on him. And so he's really curious.
I told him that Robbie fully cooperated with us and also told him about the phone calls were recorded.
You can see his wheels are turning. Now he's trying to think through the conversation.
Setting up this recorded conversation with Chuck Duncan is kind of like what we do on Cold Justice every case we work. You try to get them to give you a statement, a version of what happened, and then they're locked into it because they've said it. Then if they change that version, that can be pretty damning.
He knew he was in a lot of trouble. And so, in typical fashion, Chuck concocted another story.
I didn't do it, but I helped do it. Ruth told me she wanted a mercy killing. She wanted somebody to kill her and her husband because they were old, getting frail, and she didn't want to suffer.
And Ruth was paranoid about that. She says, I need to be able to rely on you, Chuck. She says, if I can, she says, I would do anything in the world for you and Gary and Robbie. But I got to have peace of mind, and if I can find a solution. She says, I don't want to wait until I'm in a wheelchair being given tranquilizers at a nursing home. She says, I can't face that. And she said, I would rather pick and choose the time of my death. And that's exactly what she said.
According to Chuck, Ruth asked him to find someone to kill her and she would pay for it, kind of like an assisted suicide or whatever. He called it a mercy killing. He says, I wasn't there, so I really don't know what happened. I hired 2 yard guys to go do it. And one guy's name was Oscar, and then he mowed the facility where their business was.
I told the boys, not Rob and Gary, but these Hispanics, that they were old and they wanted to go out peacefully. And this is a sum of money, and the money would be there waiting in the house, and for them to pick it up. And that was how the arrangement was.
We had no other choice but to pursue names of all the yard men. We interviewed them, and we knew it was a bogus story, but you still had to close that door.
In his mind, the fact that he presents it as a mercy killing, he would only do a little bit of time in the prison if he was found guilty.
Chuck is putting himself directly responsible for the deaths of John and Ruth High, but not admitting that he physically killed them. It didn't matter to us. We didn't need the truth. We just needed an admission, and he made an admission.
Chuck Duncan is charged with capital murder in the deaths of John and Ruth High.
This case was actually filed 2 different ways. One is it's a double murder, 2 people were killed, and also it's a murder for remuneration. When a murder is committed over money because of money, you can also file capital murder charges that way. I think that when you listen to every line of every word that came out of Chuck Duncan's mouth, Chuck Duncan did not help himself by talking that day to Billy Bell.
Billy, Sergeant Bell, is a very good interrogator,
Yeah.
very good interviewer. He's a hostage negotiator. Since I had dealt with Duncan before, I thought Billy would be a good fit.
And it worked.
And it worked.
As we get ready to go to trial, I remember, because I looked at the date, I was 5 months pregnant then.
You were?
With my daughter, who just became a prosecutor a month ago. Isn't that
Wow.
funny? It's been a lifetime, Johnny.
Yes, it has.
But this was my first cold case where it had this twist to it. And I think the big thing for me was how much the whole case came down to Robbie. I knew that I had to figure out a way to let Robbie get up on the stand and testify against Chuck Duncan. But the main challenge of trying this case with Robbie is that I didn't know what a jury was going to think about him. I didn't know what a jury of 12 people would think about a grown man being involved in this odd relationship and knowing full well that two wonderful people have been murdered and never telling anybody in law enforcement the whole truth for 6 years. How are we going to make sure that the jury understands he's credible? Because if a jury hated him, we were going to lose. One thing I had to deal with the case once y'all passed it on to the DA's office, from the very beginning I was always very stressed about Robbie. When he came forward, thank God he did, but it took 6 years. Was the jury going to hate him? You know, getting the jury ready to understand where he was coming from, and he did the right thing. Even if you think you would have handled it differently, let's see if he's credible.
Right.
He was the foundation and crux of the whole case.
Sure.
I was taught a long time ago as a baby prosecutor, every case has a theme. You take the weakness of your case and you make it your theme. So in this case, the issue with the case was, what are we going to do about Robbie? You have to take that and make it your theme and deal with it head on. He comes kind of tainted, he comes kind of muddy because of the way he came around to finally tell him what he knows. One opening statement, I brought up that Chuck Duncan committed the murder, but in August of 1993, Robbie could no longer live with what he knew, and he called and came forward. And maybe he took too long to get here, and maybe he didn't do it like you, but we are only in this courtroom because that man came forward. And the bottom line here was to make the jury believe him, even if they still didn't like him. My plan was to have Robbie testify last, so that by the time he hit the witness stand, HPD, the investigators, would have already explained the rest of the physical evidence and all the other incriminating factors against Chuck Duncan. On the off chance that maybe a couple of jurors might not like Robbie, they still understood the lay of the land and his part to play in all of this.
Kelly Siegler is a rock star. She was excellent in the courtroom before a jury. Very persuasive, methodical in building her case. But the biggest impact that my testimony had was Kelly Siegler playing the confession I had with Chuck Duncan, and in his own words, him explaining that he's ultimately responsible for the deaths because he did a mercy killing.
I told the jury, if this was really a mercy killing, why would you need to hit John High 6 times in the head? So the whole story was just stupid in the first place, and it even ended up being kind of laughable. Like, if the jury's going to buy that, come on, no one's going to believe this story, just to show yet again what a manipulative liar he is. He was too big for his own britches, as my mother used to say. So as much as I could present evidence-wise, it was time to call Robbie Duncan to the stand. Before the trial, he came down to my office and we sat there for hours going over the questions for direct. We practiced it. He knew what he needed to do and say. I tried to play defense lawyer and throw cross-examination questions at him and things that I thought that Connie Williams would pick on him about. Connie Williams was Richard Charles Duncan's lead defense lawyer. He was very well respected. He was very well known, and Duncan was very lucky to get him to be his lawyer. That was the single longest written out prep for a witness of any case I ever had, because usually you have, like 10 civilian witnesses with a little piece.
Right.
But Robbie was The motive, without Robbie's information, though, think about it, getting the jury ready to understand that Chuck killed the Highs for their money would be pretty much impossible. Robbie was the relationship and dynamic. Robbie's the one that shed light on Chuck's control over them even after confessing to the murder. He was the last witness. He was almost a whole day. He told the truth, told it like it was, and then Connie Williams cross-examined him. And I remember thinking, past the witness, okay, here we go. How's this going to go? And Connie started cross-examining Robbie, thinking as he went on, he's doing okay. You just have to sit there, right? Being cool. He's doing okay. And I thought, ooh, he did all right.
He always came across like he was telling me the truth.
Yeah. Some of it was my prep, but Robbie was pretty good. Every kind of way they could insult him, Connie did a good job of trying to do. Why did it take you this long? Isn't it true that you're mad at them and you're paying them back? Isn't it true you helped? Isn't it true you're involved? He might have gotten a little defensive, but even when he got defensive, his answers made sense. He owned that he should have come clean sooner. He owned that he should have been less of a mouse around Chuck Duncan, that he should have been more of a man and done the right thing. He owned all that. You just have to hope that at the end of the day, that came across as credible to the jury. On May the 25th, 1995, after 6 days in trial, I rested my case against Chuck Duncan. The evidence was mostly circumstantial, but it was a strong case. And I remember telling the jury in final argument, you know now what kind of a man he is. And so you go back there and you ask yourself, is this man who sits before you today guilty of capital murder? Because if you don't believe he is, are you going to let him go home with you?
I don't remember Chuck looking very concerned. I think he thought, I'm going to keep getting away with things. It was very hard to see him there, knowing that he was the one that took my grandparents' life.
The jury went out. I think it only took them about 20 minutes, and they came back with a guilty verdict, guilty of capital murder.
After that, Chuck was sentenced to death.
After all this time, John and Ruth got justice.
When the jury came back with the death penalty, I felt happy. I felt vindicated. I was glad for my dad, and I was thinking that my grandparents were in heaven shouting hallelujah.
Whatever you think of him, if it weren't for Robbie, Charles Duncan wouldn't have been executed. Because of him.
Right.
Because of him.
The whole case.
The whole case.
Right.
And that's not an easy thing to have to let your whole case rest on one person. But that's what happened.
Charles Duncan was executed by lethal injection in 2003.
Chuck's last words was, I'm innocent.
Wow. You think at the last minute, the defendant, the killer, will say they're sorry and admit it, and they never do. I've asked a lot of families after they go through an execution. The first time he got scheduled, I was supposed to come with y'all, and it got reset, because they always do. And then it finally happened in 2003, 8 years later.
There's no comparison of what happened to Chuck and what happened to my grandparents.
Right.
Even though there's not full closure, it is closing a chapter and feeling like there's been justice that's been done, for sure.
I still run into way too many families that never get justice. They're still waiting to get justice. So what would you tell somebody?
Don't give up, have hope, and be there for each other so that you can get through it.
After the trial, Ken High never tried to fight Gary High in court over the will, over the estate. They let him have his share, but they never spoke again. And when he passed away, they didn't go to his funeral. My very first cold case that was a death penalty case was far from easy. This case revolved around the issue of having a not sympathetic witness. And so addressing that head on were the keys to the prosecution of this case. Not what a lot of people think are the problems with the death penalty case, especially today in the age of DNA and forensic evidence, but it boiled down to something that simple. Justice for the High family did not come quickly. It took a lot of years. The waiting on God drawer came into play, and they finally did get justice.